A 37-year-old father and his baby son vanished into the dense Mississippi swampland during a traditional duck hunt. The case went cold almost immediately, leaving their family in a painful 2-year limbo with no answers. The silence was finally broken by a maintenance diver's discovery, an object deliberately hidden deep in a channel, holding a sinister secret the swamp had been forced to keep. The Mississippi swamps swallow the light. On November 14, 2015, the fading sun didn't just set, it dissolved into the murky water and the dense canopy of cypress trees. Juniper Conincaid stood at a remote boat launch, the gravel crunching under her feet, a sound too loud in the oppressive silence. It was 7 p.m. Her husband, Willard, 37, and their 1-year-old son, Thatcher, were hours overdue. The air, thick and humid even in the autumn evening, hung heavy. The familiar daytime sounds, the pop of shotguns, the hum of boat engines, had stopped, replaced by the whine of mosquitoes and the unsettling splash of unseen creatures. Juniper pulled out her phone again. The screen lit her face, highlighting the tension around her eyes. She dialed Willard's number. It went straight to voicemail. She tried to rationalize the silence. The swamp was a vast maze where cell service was notoriously unreliable. But Willard knew these waters intimately. He was meticulous about safety, especially with Thatcher, and had promised to be back before dark. Unable to stand still, Juniper got back in her SUV and began to drive the muddy perimeter roads that skirted the swamp's edge. Her headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating gnarled roots and Spanish moss hanging like specters. Every few hundred yards, she stopped and leaned on the horn. The sound was a desperate, artificial shriek. She waited after each blast, hoping for a shout or the rumble of an engine. Nothing returned but the echo of her own fear. As investigators later pieced together the day, they learned the morning had begun with the promise of a perfect father-son outing. Juniper had dropped them off at the launch just before dawn. Willard, a passionate duck hunter, was eager to share the tradition with Thatcher. Both were dressed in full camouflage. Thatcher was bundled in a tiny jacket and a blue knit beanie. Willard had packed his usual gear, including his prized possession, a Krieghoff shotgun, an expensive, high-performance firearm, and a centerpiece of his collection. By 10 p.m., the reality of the situation became unbearable. The silence from the swamp was terrifying. Juniper drove to the nearest town and contacted the local sheriff's department. Her voice trembled as she explained the situation. Willard and Thatcher Conincaid were officially reported missing. Juniper provided a recent photo that captured their bond. Willard smiling warmly, holding a laughing Thatcher in his lap, surrounded by tall, dry reeds. The photo wasn't from that day, but a similar trip weeks prior, a snapshot of joy now transformed into a haunting symbol of loss. As the official machinery of a missing persons case began to turn, the search for the father and son plunged into the darkness of the Mississippi swamps. By dawn on November 15th, the remote boat launch had been transformed into a bustling command center. The disappearance triggered an immediate large-scale response. The Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks joined the local sheriff's department. The urgency was palpable. A 1-year-old child exposed to the elements created a ticking clock. The environment itself was the primary adversary. The swamps weren't a single body of water, but a complex network of lakes, bayous, and narrow channels. It was a landscape where one could get lost within minutes, a maze of green and brown where the line between land and water blurred into an impenetrable wilderness. The initial focus was entirely on rescue. The prevailing theory was that Willard had experienced engine trouble or a medical emergency. Airboats, with their massive, deafening fans, were deployed first. They skimmed over the shallow, vegetation-choked waters where conventional boats couldn't navigate. The sound echoed through the cypress stands as search teams, bundled against the morning chill, began to methodically grid-search the sectors where Willard was known to hunt. The airboats moved in formation, their powerful lights cutting through the early morning mist. Searchers scanned the banks, the reeds, and the water's surface for any sign of the Conincaids. A piece of clothing, a floating decoy, an overturned boat. Every shadow was scrutinized, every ripple analyzed. Simultaneously, helicopters flew low overhead, using thermal imaging cameras to detect heat signatures. K-9 units attempted to track scents along the embankments, but the damp, muddy environment made tracking difficult. The searchers battled the environment at every turn. Thick mud sucked at their boots, and dense reeds created a claustrophobic sense of enclosure. The constant awareness of the swamp's inhabitants, alligators and venomous snakes, added a layer of danger. They called out for Willard and Thatcher, their voices strained against the landscape's vast indifference. Juniper remained at the command center, a solitary figure wrapped in a blanket, her eyes fixed on the water. Every returning boat brought a surge of hope, followed by crushing disappointment. The reports were consistently negative. It was as if the swamp had simply absorbed them. The operation continued relentlessly through the first 2 days. The urgency mounted as the window for survival, especially for young Thatcher, began to close. The weather was turning colder, with nights dipping into risky temperatures. On the afternoon of November 16th, 2 days into the search, the complexion of the case changed entirely. A team of fish and wildlife agents was exploring a sector slightly removed from Willard's hunting area. This sector was accessible by a seldom-used service road. It was here that they made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the entire operation. A deputy spotted a vehicle parked off the road, partially hidden by brush. It wasn't Willard's truck, it was a marked patrol vehicle. The sight of it, seemingly abandoned, immediately set off alarms. The vehicle was locked, and no one was inside. A quick check of the license plate identified it as belonging to Officer Odilia Van Croff, a well-respected member of the local police force. The confusion was immediate. Why was an officer's car abandoned here during a massive missing persons search? A frantic, localized search began. The command center was notified, and resources were diverted. The atmosphere shifted from search and rescue to something far more ominous. The uncertainty surrounding the Conincaids was now compounded by the disappearance of a police officer. The team fanned out from the patrol car, moving into the dense reeds and shallow water. The terrain was difficult, requiring officers to wade through knee-deep mud. The silence of the swamp seemed to deepen. It didn't take long. About 50 yards from the vehicle, hidden within a thick stand of reeds, they found her. Officer Odilia Van Croff was dead. The discovery was a brutal blow. The search for the Conincaids was immediately suspended as the area was secured as a crime scene. Officer Van Croff had sustained multiple gunshot wounds. She was still in uniform, her service weapon holstered. She appeared to have been taken completely by surprise. Homicide investigators arrived. The wounds were not from a rifle or handgun, but from pellets fired from a shotgun, the exact type of firearm used by duck hunters throughout the swamp, and the exact type Willard Conincaid had carried with him. The implication was immediate and devastating. The timeline placed Officer Van Croff's death very close to the time the Conincaids disappeared. The location was geographically approximate. The weapon type matched. Investigators scrambled to understand why she had been in that remote sector. Her patrol logs provided the answer. She was on routine patrol, not involved in the search. She had been dispatched to the area after complaints about illegal dumping. Her log indicated she had arrived, but made no subsequent radio contact. The investigation now faced a horrific duality. Were the missing hunters and the murdered officer connected? The evidence pointed toward a grim scenario. Had Willard Conincaid, for some inexplicable reason, murdered a police officer? And if so, what happened to his son? The discovery created an agonizing dilemma. If Willard was the perpetrator, the search was no longer a rescue mission, but a manhunt. But this theory didn't sit right with many who knew him. Willard was a dedicated family man with no history of violence. Juniper Conincaid was devastated by the news, but vehemently rejected the suspicion surrounding her husband. She pleaded with authorities to continue looking for them as victims. Despite her pleas, the evidence forced investigators to consider Willard as a primary suspect. The mystery deepened. If he had committed murder, why? And where was Thatcher? The swamp held the answers, but it offered no easy clues. The investigation expanded, now encompassing a homicide and a missing persons case that seemed inextricably linked. The dual investigation struggled to gain traction. The crime scene yielded little forensic evidence beyond the shotgun pellets. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing to definitively identify the shooter. The search for the Conincaids also stalled. The massive effort found no trace of them, their boat, or any of their gear. The absence of evidence was baffling. As weeks turned into months, the leads dried up. The case, despite its shocking elements, gradually went cold. Juniper was left in an agonizing limbo, mourning her family while defending her husband's name. 2 years passed. The Conincaid disappearance and the murder of Officer Van Croff became one of the region's most confounding cold cases. The swamp kept its secrets. In November 2017, exactly 2 years after the incident, The break came not from a renewed investigative effort, but from a routine maintenance job deep within the swamp system. Rhett Gable was an industrial diver who specialized in underwater infrastructure. He was contracted to inspect fiber optic cables that ran through the Mississippi swamp system. The work was often dangerous, requiring him to navigate murky depths in near-zero visibility. On this particular day, Rhett was preparing for a dive miles away from where Officer Van Croff was found. He descended into the murky water, the sunlight creating an eerie, diffused glow. Visibility was limited to a few feet, forcing him to rely on his dive light. Rhett moved slowly along the cable line when his equipment bumped against something large and solid. It wasn't a log or a rock, the shape was too regular. He directed his light toward the object. He waited for the mud to settle, and a shape gradually emerged, a large black hardshell case. He recognized it immediately as a gun case. It was covered in a thick layer of grime, indicating it had been submerged for a long time. Curiosity piqued, Rhett examined the case. The latches were unsecured. He opened it. The sight that greeted him was a stark contrast to the monotonous swamp floor. The inside featured a custom-molded interior with precise cutouts. Inside were the disassembled parts of a shotgun. Despite the grime, the quality of the firearm was immediately apparent. Rhett, a hunter himself, knew a bit about guns. He leaned closer, his light illuminating the brand name on the barrel, Krieghoff. This wasn't just any shotgun, it was a high-end, expensive weapon. The discovery struck him as profoundly strange. Why would someone dump such a valuable firearm here? It hadn't been dropped accidentally, it had been carefully packed. Rhett documented the find with his underwater camera, and then made the difficult decision to retrieve it. Back on the boat, he examined the Krieghoff more closely. The realization that he held a significant piece of evidence began to settle in. Initially, the temptation to keep the valuable firearm was strong. But when he showed his wife, Alyssa, her reaction was immediate and cautionary. She recognized the potential implications, and the story of the missing hunters and the murdered officer was well known. She voiced her concern that the shotgun might be the missing piece of that puzzle. After a lengthy discussion, Alyssa convinced him that the only responsible course of action was to turn it in. Rhett contacted the sheriff's department, providing them with the shotgun and the underwater footage. The authorities immediately recognized the potential significance. A quick search of the National Firearms Registry yielded a match. The Krieghoff shotgun belonged to Willard Conincaid. The discovery instantly reignited the cold case. After 2 years of silence, a tangible piece of evidence had emerged. The news was relayed to Juniper, bringing a fresh wave of anguish and confusion. The discovery confirmed that something terrible had happened, but offered no answers. The investigation was back on, now focused on the weapon that had seemingly materialized from the abyss. The discovery of Willard Conincaid's Krieghoff shotgun provided the first significant lead in 2 years. The central question now was unavoidable. Was this the weapon used to murder Officer Odilia Van Croff? The answer would shape the entire narrative. The shotgun was immediately transferred to the state crime lab for detailed forensic analysis. Investigators waited anxiously for the results. However, the reality of shotgun forensics quickly tempered the initial optimism. Unlike rifles or handguns, shotguns do not leave unique microscopic markings. The pellets recovered from Officer Van Croff's body were a common type, standard birdshot. While the gauge was consistent, a direct ballistic match was impossible. The crime lab could only confirm that the Krieghoff could have fired the fatal shots, not that it did. This ballistic impasse was a significant setback. The investigation was left with the same ambiguity that had plagued it from the beginning. The discovery of the gun, while dramatic, did not resolve the central mystery. It simply deepened it. Furthermore, the condition and location of the gun raised new questions. It was found miles away from the crime scene, in a deep channel, carefully disassembled and packed inside its custom case. This suggested a deliberate disposal, not the actions of someone fleeing in a panic. If Willard had committed the murder, why would he take the time to break down his shotgun and transport it miles away? It seemed inconsistent with the narrative of a desperate fugitive. The ambiguity forced investigators to reconsider alternative theories. If Willard hadn't killed the officer, then who did? The possibility that a third party was involved, that Willard and Thatcher were also victims, began to gain traction. The investigation pivoted back to the original reason Officer Van Croff was in the area: illegal dumping. While initial inquiries had yielded nothing, investigators decided to take a harder, more aggressive look. The swamps provided ample opportunity for illicit disposal of waste, and people involved in such activities might be motivated to use violence. Their focus narrowed on a local construction company. The company, owned by a man known for his aggressive business practices, was suspected of illegally disposing of hazardous waste in the remote sectors of the swamps to avoid the significant costs of proper disposal. Investigators theorized that Officer Van Croff might have stumbled upon an active dumping operation and been murdered. If this was the case, the Conincaid disappearance might be entirely unrelated, a tragic coincidence of timing and location. Or perhaps Willard and Thatcher had also witnessed the dumping and met the same fate. Evidence against the construction company mounted. Satellite imagery showed suspicious activity. Financial records indicated discrepancies in waste disposal costs. Former employees spoke of a culture of intimidation and secrecy. Convinced they had identified the perpetrators, the investigators prepared to execute a search warrant. The raid on the construction company's yard was a high-stakes operation. A convoy of law enforcement vehicles, including tactical teams, descended on the property, the atmosphere tense as officers prepared to breach the gates. A raid on a local construction company was swift and aggressive. Officers quickly secured the premises and detained the employees, but the owner came out of his office immediately, demanding to know why they were there. He was belligerent, yelling threats and trying to obstruct the search. He was quickly detained while the search teams went to work. The search was extensive, covering the warehouses, storage containers, and heavy machinery. Investigators found a lot of evidence of environmental violations. Drums of unlabeled chemicals were improperly stored and leaking into the ground, and piles of asbestos-containing materials were found hidden in a remote corner of the yard. There was enough evidence to shut the operation down and press serious environmental charges. The tension peaked when investigators entered the owner's private office. Prominently displayed on a rack were several shotguns. The sight of the weapons seemed to confirm their suspicions. If these were the guns used to kill Officer Van Croff, the case would be solved. The owner was an avid hunter, and the presence of the firearms provided the missing link. The shotguns were immediately seized and sent for forensic analysis. The investigators waited, confident they had found the breakthrough they needed. The narrative seemed clear. The construction company, caught in the act of illegal dumping, had murdered the officer and possibly the Conicaids to cover their tracks. But the analysis brought the investigation crashing back to reality. None of the shotguns seized from the company were involved in the murder. The gauges and shot types didn't match the evidence found at the scene. The raid, while successful in uncovering illegal activities, was a dead end for the homicide investigation. The illegal dumping was completely unrelated to the violence. It was just the circumstance that had put Officer Van Croff in the area, a tragic intersection of a routine patrol and a deadly crime. The investigation was back at square one. The Craig Hoff shotgun remained the only real link to the events of that day, but its story was still a mystery. Frustration grew among the investigators. They had pursued a promising lead with intensity, only to find themselves more tangled in the mysteries of the swamp. The case seemed determined to resist a resolution. The failure of the construction company lead left the investigation in a sea of uncertainty. The momentum from the discovery of the Krehoff shotgun had disappeared, replaced by a new sense of frustration. Months passed after the raid, and the initial excitement faded. The case seemed cursed, full of dramatic discoveries that ultimately led nowhere, an endless cycle of hope and disappointment. Investigators were desperate for a new angle, something to break the stalemate and provide a clear direction. In mid-2018, almost 3 years after the disappearance and murder, the lead investigator decided to look beyond conventional techniques. Traditional methods, interviews, forensic analysis, following the evidence trail, had yielded nothing conclusive. The realization dawned that the swamp itself was the primary witness and might hold clues that had been overlooked, hidden not in physical evidence but in the environmental record. This unconventional approach led him to consult with a university research team that had been studying the hydrology of the swamp system. Their research focused on the intricate dynamics of the ecosystem, water levels, salinity, and the impact of environmental changes on the delicate balance of the wetlands. To do this research, the team had deployed a network of remote sensors throughout the waterways, continuously recording environmental data. These sensors, silent sentinels monitoring the rhythms of the swamp, had been active in 2015, and their data was archived on the university's servers. The investigator met with the lead hydrologist, an expert in the complex language of water movement and sediment transport. He explained the case's parameters, the geographical areas of interest, and the critical time frame. He asked if the archived data logs from November 2015 might reveal any anomalies, anything unusual that happened in the swamp around the time of the incident. The research team, intrigued by the possibility of applying their data to a criminal investigation, agreed to analyze the archives. It was a massive undertaking, requiring the processing of millions of data points from dozens of sensors. They used sophisticated algorithms to filter the data, looking for deviations from normal environmental patterns and spikes in activity that couldn't be explained by natural events like weather or tides. The analysis took weeks, a meticulous sifting through the digital noise of the swamp's environment. The researchers cross-referenced data from multiple sensors, looking for correlations and patterns. The breakthrough came not from sensors near the crime scene or the primary search areas, but from one positioned in a remote, rarely accessed sector of the swamp. The data revealed a highly unusual, localized anomaly recorded late on the night of November 14, 2015, hours after the Conicaids vanished and Officer Van Croff was likely murdered. The anomaly was a significant spike in water turbidity, the measure of water cloudiness caused by suspended sediment. The spike was sharp, intense, and relatively short-lived, indicating a sudden, powerful disturbance of the swamp floor. The hydrologists interpreted the data. The turbidity spike was not caused by natural phenomena. The intensity and pattern of the disturbance were consistent with a motorized boat being launched or retrieved hastily during the night, its propeller churning up a significant amount of sediment from the shallow bottom. This was highly suspicious. Normal hunting activity stops at dusk, and the initial search efforts hadn't yet reached this remote area. The data suggested clandestine activity in the middle of the night, movement under the cover of darkness. This environmental evidence provided the first indication of activity in the swamp after the incident, suggesting a cover-up or an escape route that had been entirely overlooked. The location of the anomaly was crucial, a remote, rarely used boat access point situated between the crime scene and where the Croff was eventually found. Investigators immediately focused on this remote access point. It was an isolated area accessible only by a narrow, overgrown trail, a place where someone could operate without being detected. A specialized police dive team was dispatched to the location. The conditions were daunting. The access point was shallow near the shore, but dropped off quickly into a deeper channel. The water was dark and murky, with visibility near zero, even worse than the conditions Rhett Gable had faced. The dive team conducted a systematic search of the bottom near the access point. They worked primarily by touch, their hands sweeping through the thick mud, searching for anything out of the ordinary. The task was painstaking and slow. The divers, operating in a world of darkness and silence, were connected to the surface by their air hoses and a shared determination to find the truth. Their efforts yielded a crucial discovery. Preserved in the anaerobic mud of the swamp bed, an environment without oxygen that slows decomposition, they found distinct tire tracks. The tracks indicated a heavy vehicle, and a trailer had backed down the access point and into the water. The depth and pattern of the tracks confirmed the hydrologist's interpretation. A boat had been launched or retrieved here. The discovery of the tire tracks confirmed that someone had been active at this location, providing a potential link between the crime scene and the disposal of the shotgun. But the identity of the people involved remained unknown. The tracks themselves couldn't be traced back to a specific vehicle. The dive team continued their search, expanding the perimeter around the tire tracks. They began the meticulous process of recovering microevidence, sifting through the mud and sediment, looking for anything, however small, that might have been left behind. This was a search not for large objects, but for the tiny, easily overlooked traces of human activity. The conditions made the search grueling. The divers worked in shifts, their movements restricted by the heavy gear and the enveloping darkness. They collected bags of sediment for later analysis, but also searched for visible objects, their gloved fingers probing the mud with delicate precision. It was during one of these methodical sweeps that a diver found it. Embedded in the mud near the tire tracks was a small, discarded piece of plastic. It was easy to overlook, resembling a piece of trash, a fragment of the widespread pollution that plagued the waterways. But the diver recognized it as something specific. He surfaced with the object, the small piece of plastic clutched in his hand. It was a plastic wrapper, the kind used for packaging small, specialized items. The labeling was partially degraded by the long submersion, but enough remained visible to identify the product. It was the packaging for a specialized type of shotgun choke tube, a device inserted into the barrel of a shotgun to control the spread of the pellets. This wasn't just any choke tube. It was a niche, expensive product designed for high-performance hunting and competition shooting, favored by serious hunters trying to maximize the efficiency of their weapons. Investigators immediately checked Willard Concaid's known hunting gear, which had been meticulously cataloged by Juniper. He used high-quality equipment, but he did not use this specific brand or type of choke tube. The Krehoff was equipped with standard factory chokes. The realization was immediate and profound. This piece of evidence, this discarded wrapper, likely belonged to the perpetrators. After years of ambiguity and frustration, the investigation finally had a tangible clue that pointed away from Willard Concaid and toward unknown assailants. The choke tube wrapper, a seemingly insignificant piece of trash preserved in the mud, became the key to unraveling the mystery. The investigation now shifted focus, moving from the murky depths of the swamp to the specialized world of high-end hunting gear, searching for the people who had purchased this specific product. The discovery of the choke tube wrapper gave the investigation a narrow, focused avenue of inquiry. This was no longer a broad search across the vast swamps, but a precise hunt for the purchasers of a very specific item. The niche nature of the product was the key. This wasn't a common accessory found in every hunter's gear bag. The specialized choke tube was a high-end product manufactured by a company known for its precision engineering and used primarily by competitive shooters and serious hunters willing to invest significant money in optimizing their equipment. Investigators contacted the manufacturer, tracing the distribution network of this specific model. They learned that it was only sold at a few exclusive hunting outfitters within the state, stores that catered to a specialized clientele. The authorities began the painstaking process of reviewing sales records from these outfitters. They focused on the weeks leading up to the incident in November 2015, looking for purchases of that specific choke tube model. The task was complicated by the passage of time and the varying record-keeping practices of the stores. Some of the smaller outfitters kept handwritten ledgers, and not all purchases were tracked with detailed customer information. They searched for both credit card transactions and cash sales, aware that people involved in illegal activities often preferred the anonymity of cash. However, persistence paid off. At one of the larger outfitters, they found a match. The records indicated that the specific choke tube had been purchased shortly before the disappearance. The purchase was traced back to two men who had bought the item together, Ignatius Ignovac and Melvin Stover. The names were not immediately familiar to the investigators. Novak and Stover were well-known figures in the local hunting community, respected for their skill and their expensive equipment. They had no significant criminal records and had never been considered persons of interest in the Conincaid or Van Croff cases. They had been briefly interviewed during the initial canvass of local hunters, a routine procedure that had yielded no actionable intelligence. Their alibis, that they were hunting in a different sector of the swamp on that day, had checked out, and there was nothing to connect them to the incident. With the discovery of the choke tube wrapper linking them to the remote access point, investigators began a deep dive into Novak and Stover's backgrounds. They uncovered a hidden world beneath the veneer of respectable hunters. They learned that the two men were suspected of engaging in illegal commercial hunting, a lucrative black market trade involving the large-scale poaching of ducks and other wildlife for sale to unscrupulous restaurants and distributors. This revelation provided a powerful, compelling motive for the murder of Officer Van Croff. Illegal commercial hunting was a serious crime carrying significant fines and potential jail time. Novak finally stopped in a secluded area accessible only by a narrow, overgrown logging road. He grabbed a shovel from his truck and frantically moved into the trees, disappearing into the dense underbrush. The surveillance team reported his actions, realizing he wasn't just hiding. He was trying to recover or move evidence. Convinced he was about to destroy crucial evidence, investigators ordered tactical teams to move in. The confrontation happened quickly. Tactical teams, armed and armored, emerged from the woods, silently converging on Novak's location. They found him in a small clearing, digging frantically into the pine needle-covered ground. "Police, drop the shovel!" Hands in the air. The shouts shattered the forest's silence. Novak froze, the shovel falling from his hands. He looked around wildly, realizing he was trapped. A tense standoff ensued. His face was pale with fear and desperation. For a moment, it seemed he might resist, but the overwhelming presence of the tactical team convinced him of the futility of resistance. He slowly raised his hands and surrendered. He was subdued and arrested. The area where he was digging was immediately secured. The investigators knew with chilling certainty that they had finally found the answers they'd been searching for. The climax of the 3-year investigation had culminated in this remote pine forest. As Novak was taken into custody, a simultaneous arrest warrant was executed at Melvin Stover's residence. A second tactical team descended on his home, taking him into custody without incident. Stover seemed unaware of Novak's panicked actions and the rapidly unfolding events. Both men were taken to the sheriff's department and placed in separate interrogation rooms. The investigation unit was charged with a mixture of relief and grim anticipation. They had the suspects, the motive, and the circumstantial evidence, but they needed a confession to fully understand the horrific events and ensure a conviction. Novak's interrogation was met with stony silence. He was defiant and uncooperative, denying any involvement, offering no explanation for his actions in the forest. His demeanor was cold and calculating. He requested a lawyer and refused to answer any further questions. Stover's interrogation took a different turn. He was the weaker link, more susceptible to the psychological pressure. He was initially hesitant and clearly frightened. Investigators pressed him, emphasizing the seriousness of the charges, multiple counts of murder, including a police officer and a child, and the weight of the evidence. They detailed the discovery of the choke tube wrapper, the traced purchase, and the surveillance that captured Novak's panicked reaction. The turning point came when investigators informed Stover that Novak had been arrested while trying to dig up evidence. The revelation that his partner had panicked and led police directly to concealed evidence shattered Stover's resolve. He realized the game was up. The prospect of facing a life sentence, or even the death penalty, without cooperation was overwhelming. Melvin Stover confessed. The confession was detailed and harrowing. Stover explained that he and Novak were engaged in a large-scale illegal duck hunt for commercial profit, using illegal techniques to harvest hundreds of ducks. Their sophisticated operation used the remote wilderness of the swamp to conceal their activities. On the morning of November 14, 2015, Officer Odilia Van Croff, investigating reports of illegal dumping, coincidentally stumbled upon them. She had heard the excessive shooting and electronic calls and came to investigate. When she confronted them and tried to arrest them, Novak reacted with sudden, brutal violence, shooting her without warning. It was a spontaneous act of desperation to protect their illegal operation. The tragedy compounded shortly after. Willard Kincaid, having heard the gunshots, arrived to offer assistance and stumbled upon the aftermath. Seeing that Willard had witnessed the murder, they realized they couldn't let him live. They shot him as well, eliminating the only witness. The horror didn't end there. After killing Willard, they searched his hunting blind and found 1-year-old Thatcher. Panicked and unsure what to do, they took the boy with them. They couldn't leave him to die or be found, which would immediately trigger a massive investigation. They began an elaborate cover-up. They took Willard's shotgun, which might have confused the investigation, disassembled it, packed it, and dumped it in a remote channel miles away. That night, under the cover of darkness, they used their boat to transport Willard's body, triggering the turbidity sensor that would eventually betray them. They navigated to a deep area of the swamp known for a high concentration of alligators, weighted the body down, and dumped it, ensuring his remains would not be found. The environmental conditions and alligator activity explained why his body was never recovered. The fate of Thatcher Conincaid was the most agonizing part of the confession. Stover revealed they kept the boy for several days at a remote cabin. They debated what to do with him, fearing the boy might eventually identify them. Novak eventually made the cold, calculated decision to kill him. Novak took Thatcher to the same dense pine forest where he was eventually arrested and murdered him. He buried the small body in a shallow grave, hoping the remote location and time would conceal the crime forever. The confession provided the answers Juniper Kincaid had been searching for, but they were more horrific than she could have imagined. Her husband and son were not lost in the swamp. They were victims of a brutal, senseless act of violence. Armed with Stover's confession, investigators immediately mobilized to the site where Novak had been apprehended. The forensic team began the meticulous process of excavating the site where Novak had been digging. The disturbed earth marked the spot, and as they dug deeper, the horrifying truth was confirmed. They located the small skeletal remains of a child. The remains were carefully recovered, and DNA testing confirmed they belonged to Thatcher Conincaid. The discovery provided the final devastating confirmation of Stover's confession. This physical evidence solidified the case against the two men, eliminating any ambiguity. For Juniper Conincaid, the discovery ended years of agonizing uncertainty, replacing the nightmare of the unknown with the brutal reality of calculated murder. The confirmation that Willard was a victim, a good Samaritan who had tried to help, cleared his name of suspicion. Ignatius Novak and Melvin Stover were charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and numerous wildlife violations. The trials were swift, the evidence overwhelming. Stover's detailed confession, corroborated by physical evidence, the choke tube wrapper, environmental data, and the recovery of Thatcher's remains, left no room for doubt. Both men were found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. While Willard Conincaid's body was never recovered, the unexpected discovery of his shotgun by a commercial diver ultimately unraveled the complex chain of violence and deception.